All right, the purpose of this video is we're going to cover the establishment of the 13 colonies established by Great Britain and get into some of the colonial lifestyles that occurred during this time period, 1607 to 1754, which is going to cover the second period of American history, which is going to really bridge the gap from Jamestown to the French and Indian War, which will lead into the American Revolution. And so as we go through these, it's important to kind of establish similarities and differences in the three main regions of colonies. So when you're going through this, just think about comparing and contrasting the colonial development and characteristics of the Massachusetts, New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and then the Virginia and Southern colonies. Now, remember, this is just an overview of this unit. The details of it is going to come from the textbook, from the readings, and from the work that you're doing in the class. So this is by no means a replacement for what you need to read or what you're held accountable to in class as far as tests and quizzes. All right, so we know that the British colonies were obviously colonized by England. When the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 happened, it established England as the dominant country as far as early imperialism as of 1588. And one thing that you need to consider is whoever has control of the water has control of the world. And when Great Britain defeats the Spanish Armada, that's a turning point as far as England being a powerhouse in the world. Population will increase from the last video. You remember, as more crops are being brought into Great Britain, the population is going to increase, which is going to force an overcrowding issue. There's also an opportunity for investment in colonies looking for raw materials. So joint stock companies are going to develop. The Puritans and the Pilgrims are both going to come in conflict with the Church of England, led by Henry VIII, and they're going to be forced to leave Great Britain. And weak monarchs, civil wars, and the revolutions that happened during this time period are also going to play a big part. So here is a map of the 13 colonies. They're broken up into three main regions, which are the New England colonies, which is going to encompass Massachusetts, which is going to include current day Massachusetts and current day Maine, Connecticut, and Rhode Island and New Hampshire. The middle colonies are going to include New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And then your southern colonies are going to be Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. However, you can take Virginia and Maryland and create their own region, and they call that the Chesapeake. And the College Board likes to ask a lot of questions about the Chesapeake. So when you hear the Chesapeake, you need to refer to Maryland and Virginia. Now, the Carolinas and Georgia are going to be referred to as the Tidewater colonies, and these are the southernmost colonies that are going to kind of be a buffer between Spanish Florida and the colonies in itself. The colonial geography is something that's going to consider, and it's really going to set up kind of how people in the different regions are going to kind of make their living. For example, we know in the South that they're going to be rich in plantations. Well, why? Well, they have rivers that are going to flow through the southern part of the coast. There's going to be fertile land, a opportunity to grow a lot of crops, especially tobacco, rice, indigo, and then eventually cotton. Whereas in the New England colonies in the north, there's not a whole lot of room for a lot of plantations. The weather is pretty harsh in the wintertime, and so you really don't have that year-round grounding. And so when slaves start coming into the United States, they're going to be imported into the South because that's where the labor is needed in the fields. Whereas the north, you're not going to necessarily have opportunities for plantations. And then the middle colonies is exactly what it is. They kind of fall in the middle. They do have some opportunities to grow like wheat. They're known as the breadbasket colonies, but they're mainly known for their merchant economy and their harbors like Philadelphia, and of course New York being the economic center in the United States. But you can kind of see how the soil is going to be more fertile to the south than it is to the north. If you were to compare and contrast those three regions. the Virginia Charter that was signed in 1606, which was right before the establishment of Jamestown. Their goal was to come to America as part of the Anglican Church or the Church of England, and their goal was to search for gold. And so you have young men that are going to jump on these ships, and they're going to move to to Jamestown and establish that in 1607 in search of gold. Like I said before, there are all kinds of opportunities for investment. So, for an example, a corporate colony would be where they would grant a charter to a group of stockholders. So, for example, Virginia would be an example of a corporate colony where people don't necessarily are going to move to Virginia, but they're going to invest. And so, if they're looking for gold and they end up striking gold in Virginia, then those investors are going to make a lot of money. No different than investing in corporations today. Proprietary colony is going to be a colony that's granted to an individual or a group. So, for example, like in Pennsylvania, William Penn, who was a Quaker, is going to be the primary owner of the charter of Pennsylvania, and then of course, and then Delaware. Whereas Lord Baltimore or George Carteret in Maryland create Maryland as a refuge for Catholics, are going to establish the colony in Maryland. And then the royal colony is under direct control of the monarch. So an example would be like New Hampshire. The Carolinas would fall under that as well. Eventually, 8 of the 13 colonies become royal colonies, including Virginia and Massachusetts will eventually be under be held under the crown. All right. So if you're trying to sell America to a group of colonists, what would you say? There was by 1600, there were no English settlements in the New World. They had attempted to do one through Roanoke, which nobody, even to this day, nobody knows what happened to that colony. But a guy by the name of Richard Hakluyt is going to advertise benefits of colonization. He claims that England needed American colonists, and they're going to begin with small settlements, like in 1583 in Newfoundland. The Roanoke Island, which I just talked about, which vanished mysteriously in 1591. 1607, the establishment of Jamestown, which started off as an expedition for gold, but turned it into a hotbed because of tobacco. In 1612 was the established colony of Bermuda, which a lot of slaves will be imported into the Caribbean. The British are really just trying to kind of keep up with the Spanish and Portuguese attempts because they're a little lax when it comes to when it came to competition for these colonies. Britain was kind of the last one to get involved. All right, so in talking about Roanoke, that was established in 1587. It was known as the Lost Colony. It was forgotten during the English Civil War, and it was named after the Virgin Queen, Virginia. He named the region Virginia after the Virgin Queen, and it failed. And then they tried again in 1587, but they mysteriously disappeared, and all that was left was an inscription on a tree that said Croatan. And so from there, you can kind of assume what might have happened, that the Indians might have overtaken them. They might have intermarried and intermixed, or they were slaughtered by the Croatan Indians. But why come to the Americas? What was the incentive for these people in Roanoke or in Jamestown to come over? By 1600, a lot of the farmers were starting to get forced out of England because of either religion or because there wasn't a lot of land to go around. So you had a bunch of unemployed farmers who had nowhere to go. There was the opportunity for investment. By this time, they kind of made peace with Spain, and for a lot of people, this was an opportunity to start over, to have an adventure of some sort. So why not jump on a ship and come to America? All right, and so Jamestown is established in 1607. It is the first colony established in America, first successful one, permanent one, and it was created by a guy by the name of. It was actually taken over by a guy by the name of John Smith. When they came and they couldn't find any gold, they had reluctantly not grown any crops. They were not doing work to keep up with the colony, and so John Smith will take control of Jamestown, and he'll institute the policy of "He that will not work shall not eat." And so between 1609 and 1610, they were stricken because of the lack of food, and really half of Jamestown either perished due to starvation, or they left Jamestown altogether. And so, under the direction of John Smith, they were able to save the colony of Jamestown and also the establishment of tobacco. For John Rolfe was also a colonist. He is going to be responsible in 1619 of bringing your first slaves into the English colonies. But he also finds tobacco seeds for plantations. So why come to Jamestown? Economic prosperity. These were single men, and this is important, single men coming to Jamestown in hopes of making fortune in Virginia and returning to England. The previous explorers had brought home tales of vast amounts of gold and other valuable resources. A lot of it did it for the glory of the English crown, and adventurers, like I said before, wanted to take stake in English's claim and to prevent Spain from overtaking the whole colonies. It was created by the London Company, created by King the James, but he provided no funding, and the company recruited people by promising that gold could be found by anyone who made the trip, which we know was false. Because of the laziness of the colonies, they were not expected to do manual labor, and so they depended on the natives for food. And so 80%, I said 50, but it's actually 80% of the colonists are going to perish within the first year of starvation. All right. And so here's kind of an idea of the Chesapeake up the James River. Named after King James, of course, and then you see over time the different settlements that were established along the James River, where there's a lot of fertile soil, but a lot of navigable land. So what would be some geographic or environmental problems? Where they're kind of sitting ducks in the Atlantic, for one thing. So having a fort built in these settlements were very important. A lot of them would be exposed to things like yellow fever, because a lot of it is swampland, and with access to water comes things like mosquitoes and things like that. And so disease also ran rampant because it was a warm climate at times. So when Captain John Smith takes control of the government, his firm leadership is going to save the colony from starvation during those first difficult years. He's going to have the ability to grow tobacco, which is going to make the land very, very valuable, and population is going to grow as a result. And here's more that you can pause and read about the starving time in Jamestown. So here is a picture of what we think Pocahontas was when she came to England and learned a little bit of English. A lot of y'all maybe have seen the Pocahontas movies. A lot of them are historically inaccurate, except for the second one where she does actually marry John Rolfe. She does not marry John Smith, but she does save John Smith from being killed or getting his head cut off by the Powhatan Indians. And then there's a movie with Colin Farrell recently. The name of the movie is slipping my mind at the moment. The Lost World. It wasn't called Lost World. What was it called? I can't remember. But then you see some depictions of John Smith over the years. All right. So that is going to cover Virginia. Now, do not get this mixed up with your Pilgrims and your Puritans. All right. So your Jamestown is located in Virginia, and so now we're going to go up the coast and we're going to go to Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Rock. And so the Pilgrims, also known as separatists, are going to head from England to what they were hoping just north of Jamestown, but as fate would take it, the Mayflower is going to take them to a little bit northern, and they're going to land on Plymouth Rock in 1620. Before landing on Plymouth Rock, they're going to sign the Mayflower Compact. And when we start thinking about reasons why the government is, or our government is built upon democracy, the Mayflower Compact is one of those documents that heavily influences the writing of the Constitution, because under the Mayflower Compact, they decide to make laws for the good of the colony and to put their selfish ambitions aside. And so they'll sign that before stepping foot onto Plymouth Rock. And here are some depictions of the Mayflower. Some of them have been restored. If you go to Boston, there's different ports that will have a recreation of the Mayflower. Here's a picture of a rock commemorating Plymouth Rock in Plymouth, Massachusetts. If you ever take a vacation in that area, here's an example of a Wampanoag dwelling that you can see if you were to go through the experience of going to Plymouth Colony. And it's a big tourist attraction in Plymouth, Massachusetts. All right, so for people that are moving to New England, there are two groups of people. They're your pilgrims that are trying to separate themselves from the Church of England. They are going to go to Plymouth Rock in 1620. Now, your other group are going to be a group of families, and they are your Puritans, and your Puritans are going to sail to Boston in 1630, and they're going to try to establish the ideal Christian community, otherwise known as City on a Hill. And so you've got two groups of people. Now, all of them are Puritans, but the Pilgrims are separatists. Puritans want to purify themselves from the Church of England, but not all Puritans are Pilgrims. All Pilgrims are Puritans, however, they're just a different section. Hope I didn't confuse you there. In the New England colonies, they are, your Rhode Island colonies, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. As Massachusetts wants to expand west, they're going to expand west into Connecticut. And then when Roger Williams leaves Rhode Island, or he gets expelled from Rhode Island, he's going to create Rhode Island, or he's expelled from Massachusetts. He's going to create Rhode Island and establish religious toleration in that area. So just some characteristics regarding the New England colonies. As far as the geography is concerned, rocky soil, rapid rivers, a short growing season, very good harbors. They were mainly made up of small family farms. Their occupations centered on trades such as fish and lumber, crafts, manufacturing such as shipbuilding, and they participated in the triangular trade. The demographics, they were made up of groups of people, families that migrated to the colonies. They were relatively equal in the numbers of men and women and adults and children, so a very young colony. Their population is going to increase due to just a natural increase because they were young, but they were primarily white, and then 95% of them were English. As they grow, it's going to cause conflict between themselves and the natives, and so you've got instances like like King Philip's War that occurred in 1675 and 1776. It erupted in New England between the colonists and the Native Americans as a result of tension over the colonists' expansion activities. The bloody war waged up and down the Connecticut River in Massachusetts and the Plymouth and Rhode Island colonies, eventually resulting in 600 English colonials being killed and 3,000 Native Americans, including women and children on both sides. King Philip, the colonists' nickname for Metacom, the chief of the Wampanoags, was hunted down and killed in 1676 in a swamp in Rhode Island, ending the war in southern New England. In New Hampshire and Maine, the Saco Indians continued to raid settlements for over a year and a half. But when the English defeat King Philip and the Wampanoags, they're able to push west. So as far as politics and religion, they were internally connected. The Democratic members were for the members of the church, and so there is no separation of church and state. Their town is going to have a big church in the middle of their towns, and their political meetings are going to be held in those churches. And so the meeting house of membership they took place in a congregational church. All right. So if you're going to describe what is a Puritan, just some things to consider. Puritans believed in God's plan of creation, that all individuals were born with original sin, and God had predestined some people, what we call the elect, for salvation, and that's what a Calvinist believes, as you can see on this. Puritans had a strong sense of sovereignty of God and the depravity of humanity. They strived hard to live in the accordance of God's will. People were innately unequal, and only the saints could run the church and the elite elite and the government. Church membership was a prerequisite for participation in politics. Puritans came to America specifically to create a model city on a hill, which we know as Boston, which was a Puritan utopia in the wilderness. Now, in 2019, when you think of Boston, you don't necessarily see it as this ideal Christian society, because as time goes on, people begin moving away from the church. The Puritans had a covenant or a contract with God. If they kept the contract, God would grant them saving grace. These are beliefs what the Puritans believed. Puritans believed it followed logically that civil government stems from a voluntary agreement by all church followers in distribution of communal land. Puritans allocated acreage to individuals based on family size, the need, and the skills that they valued by the community. Everyone was legally required to attend church services, and since the Scripture offers solutions to all kinds of problems of individual conduct, church and the secular government and the social organization and educated citizenry was necessary and enabled individuals to interpret the meaning of the Scripture for their lives. They strongly believed in the correctness of their views and stood ready to use the power of the state to enforce religious uniformity. And so that kind of describes the Puritans. Now, when they came over in 1630, that's going to be called your first Great Migration. So this is a migration of British Puritans coming over to Massachusetts Bay and settling there. Their leader was a guy by the name of John Winthrop, which you see here, and you see this is his speech on creating the city on a hill. It is sermon called The Model of Christian Charity. And if you were to read this, you would find that they believe, where is it? That may the Lord make it like New England, for we must consider that we should be as a city on a hill. The eyes of the people are upon us, so that if we deal falsely with our God, it is the work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his presence from us. We shall be made a story and a byword through the world. And that was their vision for Boston and the city on a hill. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson are two people that will be expelled from Massachusetts. Roger Williams will create Providence in Rhode Island, and then Anne Hutchinson will go to New Hampshire. All right. So why come over to Massachusetts Bay? Obviously, religious freedom. They wanted to, if you were a separatist, you wanted to separate yourself from the Church of England. Puritan wanted to purify themselves from the Church of England. We've kind of already gone over this. You can kind of read over it. We've talked about the Mayflower Compact. The difficulties is that they landed December 21st, and if you've ever been in Boston in December, it's very, very cold, and so they're also going to go through a time period where they're not going to have any crops grown, but with the help of a Native American named Squanto, they'll begin to grow crops in the spring. Because of the strength of the Mayflower Compact, this was the real fruit of their success and one of the reasons why they were able to survive. And when they got there, there was already land kind of already cleared because the natives have already done it. And under the leadership of William Bradford, Miles Standish, and with the help of the Wampanoags and Squanto, they were able to learn to grow corn. Which this leads to the first Thanksgiving. Now, for the extra credit, don't worry about that, obviously, because this is more of a lecture. All right, so for the middle colonies, all right, so your middle colonies are going to be your New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. These are established as New Amsterdam by the Dutch. We talked about this in the last video. And their city, or the city, New York City, used to be called New Amsterdam. They sold the land to the British, and they renamed it New York after the Duke of York. Pennsylvania and Delaware were both settled by William Penn and the Quakers. Now, Quakers had a great relationship with the Indians because of fur trade. Quakers were pacifists; they were anti-war, and they believed in chasing their inner light, which would be their conscience. And so, for the middle colonies, they had good land. For their economy and their geography, they had good land to be cleared. They had three major rivers: the Hudson River, the Delaware River, and the Susquehanna. They were good harbors. They were known as the breadbasket of the colonies. They trade in food. They also included it in their triangular trade. The people that lived there, their demographics made up. There were by 1700 there was twice as many people living in New England than in the middle colonies. By 1770, the populations had of the regions had roughly equaled out. Immigrants by 1800, most immigrant 30% of Pennsylvanians and 50% of the middle colonies were of English descent. So a lot of immigration coming into that area. They were made up of lower and middle class families. There were merchants, artisans, and servants in the cities. There were small landowners in the interior, of course, growing wheat and barley. Their politics, they were mainly Lutherans. We already talked about Quakers. Religion was not dominant, was not a dominant political factor in the colonies as a whole, and they are fairly democratic. And so, as you can see, a lot of these colonies are going to start developing their own distinct governments and their own distinct societies, whereas Great Britain is not necessarily going to enforce that. At least early on, not until the French and Indian War. And so, when the British start instituting their laws, they're going to start rebelling against the British. So here's kind of a little thing about Pennsylvania and William Penn and the Quakers. He believed in using Pennsylvania as a holy experiment where they provide a religious refuge for all religions, liberal political ideals, economic success, a good relationship with the natives, and framing having a frame of government and a charter of liberties, or a society of friends, as they called it. They were unlike any other colonies, and they came from all different countries. And you can kind of see, we've already talked about the Dutch and how they were used to be New Amsterdam before it became New York, and even Sweden had some input as far as the colonies. And then here's more stuff about William Penn. William Penn as a Quaker discovering Pennsylvania and the Quakers having rights. They did not belong to the Church of England. They were peace-loving people, and they believed in no war. Here's more about Pennsylvania. They earned trial by jury. So a lot of these things you're going to see reflected in our Constitution. All right, so why invest in the middle colonies? Their soil was all ideal for farming. The climate was great, is great year round, which also helped farming. They were very big on industry, and you know New York is going to become the economic center of the colonies and of the United States today. So you know this is going to be a hotbed for economy and commerce. So they're very big on industry, very religious, tolerant, and they practice a representative government. Here is a painting by Benjamin West. Depicting William Penn. So William Penn is located. Where's he? He's right here. And so you can see how the Indians. This is a peaceful negotiation of trade, and you can see very docile, and you can see the civilization built in the background. So they're very accepting of each other. All right, and so you're going to see the establishment of the Mason-Dixon line here, which is going to be the southern part of Pennsylvania, which is going to divide Pennsylvania and Virginia. And so that's why we consider Virginia a southern colony. And when we get into the Civil War, you're going to see the split between the Union and the Confederacy along the Mason-Dixon line. So just kind of something to look at going forward, and just to have an idea. We talk about the Mason-Dixon line. Now, as far as the southern colonies, they're a little bit more diverse, and so when it comes to the southern colonies, when it comes to Maryland was created as a refuge for Catholics, and they were accepting of all religions, led by Lord Baltimore. They're going to sign a document called the Maryland Act of Toleration. And so where do we get our first amendment of freedom of religion is from the Act of Toleration. Virginia, we've already talked about with Jamestown. The Carolinas were mainly known for their growing of tobacco, rice, and indigo. And then Georgia, created by James Oglethorpe, is going to be the last of the 13 colonies that's going to be established in 1732. And the purpose was for two reasons. One, it's going to be created as a place for debtors and criminals to colonize. But why colonize in Virginia? Well, if they had a fear that the Spaniards in Florida would at some point invade north into the colonies, and so this actually served as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the 13 colonies. And so if they had to go through that, they were going to go through those criminals and debtors. All right. Lord Baltimore founded the colony of Maryland, and we already talked about the Religious Act of Toleration. We've talked about the Carolinas; they're pretty much religiously free. So I'm going to go back here to the map. All right, so looking at geography and commerce, they're very fertile land, very fertile soil, abundant rainfall, and a long growing season. Their cash crops were tobacco and then rice and indigo. It was a plantation economy dependent on coerced labor, uh, with natives and then indentured servants and then African slaves. They were the fastest growing region of the colonies. By 1700, the population was 9 times what it was in 1700. By 1770, there was twice as many people in the southern region as in either the middle or the New England colonies. There was a rapid growth of black population, largely due to the natural increase of slaves. Between 1700 and 1770, they're going to grow between 20,000 to 400,000 slaves. And by 1770, slaves had the portion of the population had grown to about 40%. In the region, 8 out of 10 slaves and 9 out of 10 whites lived in the Chesapeake, Maryland, and Virginia. 80% of the Southerners had now 80% of Southerners owned fewer than 20 slaves, and so here's where you have kind of this planter aristocracy, which if you owned more than 20 slaves, even though you're a minority of the population, you held the most power, and 50% of Southerners owned fewer than 5 slaves. And whereas a lot of people rebuked slavery, it was their idea of living the American dream would be to own slaves. For politics and religion, they were based on the Church of England and African American Christianity. The Anglican Church was established, but faith was not terribly robust, which means they didn't follow it. And political participation was limited to wealthy landowners, especially in the Virginia House of Burgesses in Virginia, which is our first form of representative government in those colonies, in the colonies. All right, so as we start getting into slave culture, we know that when immigrants come to America, they're not going to go to the South because there are no jobs in the South because they're completely taken over by slaves. And so a lot of immigrants that are moving into New York are going to stay north and look for jobs in manufacturing. We know that farms are going to grow large plantations of tobacco, rice, and indigo, mainly because the rivers are going to provide fertile land. Virginia was founded as a tobacco plantation. We've already talked about Virginia House of Burgesses, the first legislative assembly in the colonies. Now, in 1876, there's going to be a rebellion, and this rebellion is called Bacon's Rebellion. And basically, what this is as we put this is going to be a common theme. Is as we push west, you're going to see an encounter between the farmers that are living in the western part of Pennsylvania and the natives. And so when it came to Bacon's Rebellion, there's going to be an encounter between these indentured servants and the Indians. And so when they call for help from William Berkeley, who was the cousin of the Virginia governor, William Berkeley is not going to send help, and as a result, Bacon is going to lead an attack on largely peaceful Native American tribes. They're going to give the backcountry a greater say in politics and suffrage for all freemen, and a say in taxation. Basically what he's going to do is he's going to gather his men and he's going to march to Jamestown and burn down Jamestown. Now, why is this important? Because it shows that indentured servants, who were half the population at the time, they were drawn to Bacon, and if they were going to do this rebellion, then they would be likely to do it again. And so, even though they burned down several plantations and they marched to Jamestown, Bacon will die Nathaniel Bacon will die in the rebellion, and so a lot of people will not trust they'll not trust indentured servants because they're untrustworthy. So for the planter aristocracy, the realization of their worst fears, there's a possibility of this class consciousness among small-time planters, yeomen farmers, and indentured servants. The system of indentured servitude was short-term solution to the labor problem, which created long-term expectations among whites, lower class, that could still be claimed as the rights of Englishmen. And so this is where you see the introduction of slavery play a dominant role in the South. And so here's more things about Bacon's Rebellion. less dependent on indentured servants, increased importation of African slaves, and more aggressive policies towards Native Americans. All right. And so this takes us to the colonial lifestyle. This is where I'm going to stop this video for now. The big thing, remember, is to be able to compare and contrast the three groups of colonies. Can you establish between, the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies? The College Board loves asking questions about those three things. All right. And so now what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to talk about the development of lifestyle leading to the French and Indian War as more of these colonies develop their own distinct lifestyles.